Thank you, Mr. Chair. I totally agree that early hypotheses change. As for the politicization of this and the accusations made that this is entirely political, I think we do have something to learn about finding out the true origins of this disease. It's interesting that when they talk about censoring and politicization of something, only one side that I remember was ever censored, and that was our side. And when I say our side, I mean the fact that it was a lab leak. I was censored as the emergency physician who treated thousands of patients and who has a background taught by an equally adept professor in virology at medical school that taught us how diseases propagate. One of the things I thought was interesting, I think it's very wise of you to admit that there's many possibilities. And just to lay it out in front of the people, since I'm the summary person today, it's interesting that any other crossover virus or any virus that's ever really existed, for the most part, still exists in society today. It's very hard to get rid of an entire subset of viruses by itself. We still have the common cold, for example. We still have avian flu. We still have swine flu. And those still propagate in those species because they don't just go away. They continue to get switched around, and it still exists in society today. What I think is interesting is that I haven't seen any evidence, and I read your papers, by the way. I love reading and learning. I consider myself a student of the game. And I saw how we talked about the raccoon dogs and the civet cat having DNA and RNA in the same place where they found the vast preponderance of the coronavirus in that market. However, what we didn't see is that there is any immune response by those animals to this virus that supposedly can propagate inside that species also, which would be a natural way to propagate a virus by virology standards, which you'd have to admit. If it exists in the species, it has to be able to propagate and continue. It doesn't just go away. It's not just found in the same proximity of a species, but inside the species with antibodies and resistance. To say that it's just because it's in the same area as somewhere that a dog was found or a cat was found or a penguin, whatever you want to say, is for me just like smear some COVID on this wood and say, look, it came from this wood. To give our people who are watching this who are maybe not medical background to understand that's obviously impossible. Just like it's impossible to have a virus that exists inside of an animal species go away or not have any sort of immune response or any propagation if that's where it came from in the beginning. And that's where I find a huge hole in your theory. As scientists, I love science. I'm trying to follow your science, and I don't get it. I just don't get it. It doesn't matter if it's found in the same area. Did it continue to live in that species? Is it still found? I know for a fact China has looked for it hard and killed lots of animals trying to find it and cannot find this natural immune response and this natural propagation inside of these species. So therefore, my natural conclusion is it didn't come from there. What I do know, if I use just logical thinking, and I've heard your responses, so I get it. I don't really have too many questions because I've heard your responses over and over again. But I'm just from a scientific standpoint, I want to summarize this for folks who aren't scientists. I just explained the science behind this. That if you can't find it, you can't find the immune response, you can't find disease propagating inside of a species, then it really never existed in that species, and therefore that's not scientific. And likewise, if you have a science lab talking about actually developing something and wanting funding for it, in other words, gain of function, and then it centers around that same lab that asked for it, I agree with your initial assumption, Dr. Gary, that most likely it came from a lab. And I think that's where the evidence has continued to point. Ironically, when it got politicized, it was myself and others that believe like me in the science that got censored. That's the irony of this. And yet I'm accused of politicizing this. I just want to make it very clear for those people who are watching who are not scientists that this is a scientific discussion. But it's also a political discussion because we have to figure out where it came from in order to deal with the next pandemic. And if we're going to try to assume that we're going to stop the evolution of viruses in the wild, that's not something we can really do much for. We can prepare for it, but we can't stop that. But we can stop gain-of-function research when we admit that that's where the disease came from. And I think that's what this discussion is about. And that's why it's important to actually combine the science with common sense, and we come to a natural conclusion. And with that, I yield.